Welcome to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Jamie Almanzan. And Jamie, I'm actually in Boston right now, and I'm in a room that is completely wood paneled.
In fact, the wall behind you looks like a floor. Looks like you're laying down, kind of.
Oh, what a feeling. Because I'm dancing.
How's that?
I'm like, I'm going to pull something, trying to do dancing on the ceiling. Okay, time to get serious. I want to, obviously we have not listened to this conversation yet. You're just at the beginning of our conversation, but I want to talk about our guest, Michelle Osterhoudt. And I wanted to ask you a question about something that she said, and she didn't exactly give examples on how to do this. Well, maybe that's not fair, because she does say you can't remain silent. You have to speak up. I'm curious though, based on the work that you do and the coaching that you do all over the country around the term, she said, it's not enough to be an ally. We need people to, when they witness things, they need to call it out. And I imagine that comes up quite a bit, really frequently in your conversations with schools. And I'm curious how you navigate those conversations.
He says, here, I'll read it to you. People say that they're an ally and they support us in the work. And we got you. But what does that mean? Really, we need people to be disruptors. And I know teachers are not very comfortable doing this. And then she goes on to say, where is it? It's not enough to be an ally and say, that's wrong. I agree with you. I support you in whatever you're going to do to solve that problem. We need them to interrupt as much as stand next to me. Do you experience the term ally the same way she's defining it?
That's interesting. Okay, I want to answer your question. However, I want to tell you why I asked you the question is because you had mentioned in a previous conversation about how marvelous students were in disrupting. You had a student who had said something egregious to an African-American student who then went to the principal, and the kids were like, hey, we got this. We got this. And so I thought, wow, there's some intentional work being done through your organization to help the adults be disruptors, and maybe even more importantly, giving kids the skills, or at least lifting up their voice when they say, here's how we're going to disrupt this, because it sounds like that's what happens in your work.
In that case, yes, students not only did the initial interrupting, but also did the teaching and repair work with each other. So much so that as the incident, they used the N-word in, I think, the cafeteria, if I remember right, elevated through the ranks of school and got to the principal. The principal was prepared to suspend the white kid who had used the N-word in the cafeteria line. And it was the black student who had been the receiver who said, I don't actually think this person needs to be further disciplined, negatively disciplined. We got this. And the principal was like, wow. Oh, okay. And that was just a delightful reflection on the power of students to do that for themselves and care for each other, and actually do want to care for each other, which is also to your point of, I think the we are one idea, though that's a big district. If the school feels that, if that's the cultural field of the school, the students had an anchor to connect to say, you're right. I don't want you to feel that way. I use the word without maliciousness, but stupid. I was stupid. That was stupid.
Did you enter that cultural field and just remark how wonderful? Or do you feel that the work that you were doing there over time helped create that? Help set the stage
work that we did. Helped
that's what I thought.
Merely because we were pulling students together and giving them.
I want to be really clear on that. Yeah, exactly. This wasn't like, hey, wasn't this great? But rather
to use words, to use we train them to use different language. We train them to understand language. We train them to talk about it with their teachers. And the white kid happened to say it to a kid who was in that training, and that kid, the black kid, was like, "Oh, I know some stuff."
Yeah.
And that's how
to answer your question, one way that I would define ally is to be that voice in the room when your colleague is not in the room, because that's typically when you start to hear things, and is to be that voice to disrupt whatever pattern of conversation is happening. Well, I don't think she's ready for that job, or I don't know if she seems to leave early, or I think this guy, because he's got experience in finance, would probably be the better person for this. I'm going to use finance because I know that really rubs you. And so I remember a colleague of mine who led a lot of our equity work reminding me on what allyship looks like. It isn't just in the moment when we're all together, all singing from the same choir book or whatever, but rather in the moment when they're not there, stepping in an uncomfortable, potentially situation to right a potential wrong, or when you see that the conversation is going in a direction, is to remind people what our values are and what we believe, and that this is the moment we're going to stand up and be an ally.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the difference between the phrase stand behind you and stand with you.
So funny.
And so
early on in the podcast, if you listen to any of those early episodes, people will say like, I'm right behind you. And I'd say, well, how far behind me are you? You know, I'd rather be linked arm in arm. So I love that.
How far? It's right. Pretty far.
We're right behind you. Well, I don't think I can see you. Is that you back there?
I don't mind the way she used the word, and I fully understand what she's trying to say. And to me,
well, she's the only one in her district, and she's or one of two, and she's calling out a community to be allies. And my heart really hurt for her. You could tell this has been hard work. Yeah.
Well, why don't we listen to Michelle and let's see what she has to say, and then we'll come back and talk about being a superintendent.
What an excellent idea. You are listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question, because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools. Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guest is Michelle Osterhoudt, the superintendent of Margaretville Central Schools in Margaretville, New York. Michelle, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you so much, Peter. I am so happy to be joining you today.
I am so happy to meet you. Now, we were introduced by a mutual friend in education, Andrew Murata. And if
I love me some Andrew Murata.
Oh my God, he's a whole lot of Murata. If you listen to
He is a whole lot of Murata.
My God. And he's always reminding us to survive and to thrive. And I'm really grateful to him for putting us together. So I know he's smiling right now. If it's okay, I'd really like to start with something that you wrote about your daughter. What I read was, it was so meaningful to me because I similarly had a revelation about my second child around his relationship to schools. I used to say it was complicated, and then I realized it's not that complicated. He just really didn't like going to school. So, which is hard for a superintendent. It's like the preacher's child, right? Like who doesn't like to go to church. But your daughter's journey, it was such a powerful example of how stepping away from traditional schooling can really open up one's doors to practical hands-on learning. And so for families and educators who are maybe considering a similar path, what advice would you offer on rethinking what high school should look like, especially for students who might thrive outside that traditional schooling model?
I come from the old model of school where when you graduated high school, you either got a Regents diploma. So I'm in New York State, and New York State is known for its Regents diploma. You got a Regents diploma or you got a local diploma. And that meant two things. You get a Regents diploma, you're likely candidate for college. Local diploma, you're going to enter the workforce, you're going to enter the military. So, we kind of pigeonholed kids into what they were going to do with their lives. And so I tell you that because that's a framework for where my thinking has always been, right? You're either going to go to college or you're going to go to the workforce. And I was always taught that education is the key to success. That's how I was brought up. That's how a lot of people my age were brought up. And so when my daughter struggled to get through school. Now, let me tell you, she didn't struggle because she wasn't smart. I consider myself relatively intelligent. She is smart. She didn't connect with her teacher. She didn't connect with students. She's kind of an old soul, if you will. She's a hands-on learner. A lot of school is not always hands-on learning. I think we're seeing a shift right now in how we educate kids, and it goes in cycles, right? But long story short, after the pandemic, she really struggled to get back into the flow of things at school. And we discovered that she had a learning disability. We discovered that she had some anxiety. And those were things that were always there, but they really came to surface during the pandemic. And it was a struggle for her to go to school every day. And to be honest with you, she was bored. It was hard for her to focus. And I'd go to parent conferences and they'd be like, Ella doesn't participate. Ella doesn't engage. We don't really know Ella. And in the back of my mind, I was always thinking, what did you do to engage Ella? And what did you do to get to know Ella? Because she's a pretty amazing human being. But what ended up happening was it was a struggle to get her to go to school every day. And eventually we needed to seek out a different program. And I happened to be working in a neighboring district where they happened to have a program called the CARE program. And it was a social emotional learning program, meaning that the most important thing for kids in that program was for them to be socially and emotionally ready to be at school. So they had some wraparound counseling support. They had some wraparound project-based learning. So everything they did was about solving a problem, hands-on learning, connecting with the community. That was an interest to her. And it was a smaller class sizes, and that made it a little bit easier for her to go to school with her anxiety. But let me tell you, just knowing that there was support for her at school every day was enough. It felt safer because it was just an environment that she could be herself in. And because it was a smaller environment, she got to know the adults.
I was going to say, you're really speaking to the establishing community. I mean, this was what every school, every classroom ought to have, whether it's a restorative sort of the restorative practices activity or ritual of circling up every morning to get to know each other, to know the way you were describing when teachers say, well, I don't really know her. It's that what they're saying is, well, your daughter hasn't made an effort to get to know me, as opposed to what is my job to get to know every child authentically in my classroom.
That's exactly it. And so the program was wonderful for her until it wasn't. So what's happened the last few years in education, I think most of us know this, is it's hard to retain staff. Coming out of the pandemic and new programs, and teachers are leaving the profession, administrators are leaving the profession, people are leaving education. It's hard work. Some of it has to do with because the school is so many things to kids, right? We feed them, we clothe them, we counsel them. There's so much that we do. We're social services for students. And I'm not saying
and the pandemic put a spotlight on that, didn't it? It showed where the gaps are in a community when the schools were not able to be in person, in seat every day, and how they then were expected to. And because our hearts are for children, we felt a compelling purpose to do it was, how do we make sure we get food to children? How do we make sure we get services to children? How do we make sure we get technology? How do we make sure that we're checking on every family who may have instability, housing, food, health, all those types of pieces fell on the schools to do.
And some of that became too much for educators. And then even moving forward, when we brought them back, it was just so much.
Yeah. So, my gosh, I remember elementary teachers who were doing, bedtime stories with their classes. And I'm going, oh my God, this is amazing because these are amazing humans. And at the same time, I'm thinking, what are we doing? Yeah.
Yeah. As a principal, I would read, So what ended up happening with her program, which started out as a really great program, and I credit the program for getting her back to school because we were having a hard time getting her to school. So I would credit the program for that. But then eventually the program wasn't working because they had a hard time maintaining staff. So what ended up happening, she was going to school and then learning online because they didn't have enough teachers. So it became a struggle. And I got to tell you, hardest decision I ever made was in March of 2024, allowing my daughter to drop out of school. I'm a superintendent, Peter, and her counselor said, it was damaging our relationship, our mother-daughter relationship, me forcing her to go to school because school really wasn't cutting it for her. It was not a healthy environment. It had become not a healthy environment. And I'll say, really, through no fault of the school itself, it was, it's hard. It's hard. Retaining and recruiting teachers is hard now. So I let her drop out of school. Within a month, Peter, of dropping out of school, she was accepted to college because she was always a good student. And then 2 months after that, she got her GED. She'd actually taken some pretty rigorous courses while she was in the program. So her transcript was actually pretty rich. But what that taught me was that there's different avenues for kids to learn. And the end all be all isn't that traditional high school diploma. You can still be successful by going a different route. But isn't it a shame that the way that I could get her through school was to allow her to drop out? We need to have different pathways. We have to look at education differently. Some kids need more time, some kids need less time to get through their coursework.
I'm having these same conversations with my co-host Jamie Almanzan about the Carnegie units, right? This is how we measure learning. And we're at a time where, to your point, there are children who have such accelerated learning that they learn quickly. They do some of their own work on their own time, and they're ready to move on. And there are children who need additional support and additional time, additional resource. So one of the things that Jamie would also say to me is, why didn't you ask her? So I'm going to say, what are some ways that you're doing that in your own district?
That's a great question. So New York State has what's called this regionalization initiative. And so there's two things I'd love to talk about. And I'm a big champion for these initiatives that are coming out, because for the first time in my tenure as an educator, so 25 plus years, I feel like I have a voice and a seat at the table. So regionalization involves connecting with your community members, connecting with neighboring school districts, connecting with businesses, connecting with anybody who has an interest in educating kids to bring opportunities to kids that are different from traditional school. What does that look like, you ask? My students will have the ability to take EMT courses and CNA courses before they graduate high school by leaving campus and taking courses at Margaretville Hospital. My students currently right now are bused to a neighboring school district that offers physics class because we don't have that. They're going to come to our district next year to take chemistry because they don't offer that. So being creative in things that you can offer students. My students went to go see a Broadway play because I connected with the Margaretville Arts Center, a local non-for-profit, and they're working with my students in drama classes. So anything that gets them, listen, school is great. Some kids do traditional school very well, but not everybody. So you have to have, I feel like it's like a la carte. You got to have all these different options for kids to choose from for a number of reasons, because it meets their learning needs, but because it engages them. They find their niche, they find their dream. The second thing is New York State is changing its graduation requirements. So instead of all students needing to pass 5 Regents exams, for example, students can still get a diploma by passing Regents exams, right? I was a nerdy kid. I like taking tests, right? My daughter doesn't necessarily like taking tests. She does okay, but she doesn't necessarily like taking tests. She would have the ability, instead of taking a Regents exam in social studies, earning her seal of civic readiness, which shows that she's able to be a contributing member of society through civic duty, through connecting with the community, through collaboration with folks in the building, joining clubs, being a civic-minded individual. That might be her jam. More my jam might be, I want to take a test to show you what I know. So New York State is moving away from a local diploma and a Regents diploma, one diploma, which is wonderful, that you can affix different seals to it. So you can have a Regents seal, you could have a seal of civic readiness. We just recently offered the seal of biliteracy, so students can graduate speaking 2 languages. And that is a wonderful need to employers. So it's offering options to kids so that they can learn on their own terms and realize their own dreams of what they want to do.
If you're just joining us, our guest today is Superintendent Michelle Osterhoudt. Michelle, in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension, it's called the leader's learning work. And leader's learning work is really the mind of the work. And inside that domain is a term, systems thinking and design thinking. And it's here that I think about this phrase. A system structure generates its behavior. So we're just having this rich conversation around different ways that school districts are thinking about dismantling the old systems of saying, well, how could we possibly allow a child to go to a different district to take a certain class because we don't know how to figure out the time because we have to reimburse you for the time that the child's in your district. That's a technical problem that we can figure out. Like, we need to do this for children. And that language, system structure generates its behavior. It comes from the Water Center for Systems Thinking. When I was listening to an interview with you about how you were out with your daughter doing work on behalf of the NAACP, and the field in your car, and I mean the cultural field, all that energy around you was a field of hope and a field of promise, and you had Earth, Wind, and Fire was going, and it was abruptly and aggressively that field was popped by someone calling you the N-word. And I really went back and forth about, do I ask her about this? But I really think it's important. And the reason why is because, sorry, this is kind of emotional, but it's like, it seems to me that more and more we're learning from leaders around the country around hate speech in our schools and in our communities. And it's the burden is on superintendents and leaders to navigate that and do something about that. So swastikas in schools are being drawn on walls and desks. And I guess with the new year, I'm searching for advice that I can share with other leaders. And if you're uncomfortable with this experience, I totally can move on to other questions. I'd be grateful, though, if you would talk maybe a little bit about that. And then I have a follow-up about what leaders can do about it.
Yeah. So I'm not uncomfortable. In fact, it's interesting that you thank you for asking me if you could talk about it. I share my story a lot. And I share my story because I'm a teacher, right? By nature, I'm a teacher. I'm a superintendent, but I'm a teacher. And I share my story because oftentimes it does fall on me when these things happen in school. And I've addressed that with students in my current district and throughout my educational career. And what I found was that by sharing my story, it helps people understand. By sharing my story and having difficult conversations, you can bring something to light. And here's what the biggest advice that I would give to folks is it's not enough to be an ally. So I'll talk about a couple of things. People say that they're an ally and they support us in the work and, we got you. But what does that mean? Really, we need people to be disruptors. And I know teachers are not very comfortable doing this, but I'm going to tell you my experience where I work and where I live. I'm usually the only person who looks like me. Okay, so I'm the second person of color in this district. I hired the other one. Usually, I'm the only person. So typically people will come to me, not only because of the color of my skin, but because of the work that I do, the social justice work that I do with our local NAACP. I was the past president of our local NAACP. I actually stepped down from that work because of everything else that I'm doing, but it's still in my heart. So it's not enough to be an ally. We need people to, when they witness things, because I'm here to tell you, Peter, that teachers will witness things and avoid addressing them because they're uncomfortable. But we have to do, and I'm telling you, this has been my experience. They're uncomfortable. So they just sort of pretend they don't see it or hear it, or maybe they address it quietly. But what we need is people to be disruptors and call out those things. If a teacher sees or hears a student doing something that's wrong or inappropriate, they need to call it out. And I know this is going to go a little bit against, SEL, but as a teacher, I'd call it out. Even if it meant embarrassing a student, because then we would address it and I would teach them how to have an uncomfortable conversation. Listen, I hear you. What you said was wrong. Let's talk about why it's wrong. And then creating a safe space to have those conversations. Now, I understand that a lot of people are comfortable doing that. Hopefully you have a leader or a teacher leader or a principal or a superintendent who's comfortable facilitating that discussion initially in the classroom so that then teachers can then continue to do that on their own. The only way we're going to get around this and maybe hopefully stop it in our school communities is by being disruptors. It's not enough to be an ally and say, that's wrong, I agree with you, that's wrong, and I support you, and whatever you're going to do to solve that problem. You can hear kids in the hallway. I'm sorry if you hear kids. Lunchtime, they're going by.
In fact, I was just thinking it's also the kids who are, if we do our job well, they'll pause because it will be such a disruption to the environment that they hear it and go, no, we don't do that here.
It's hard. So for a very long time, I was a middle school teacher, and middle school is the hardest. High school, they start to get a little bit bold and they'll speak out. In elementary, they're so young that they just tell you what they think anyway, right? Middle school is that time when they're trying to figure themselves out. And very often kids know when things are wrong, but they're too afraid to speak up. So we want them to. So I think that you do that in the confines of individuals' classrooms where they're comfortable. And I have some great teachers here. I have a social studies teacher who does restorative circles. And he teaches through restorative circles, not only SEL, but like content in his classroom. He has discussions that way. You create a safe space that kids will begin to call each other out in a loving, caring way. Because it's not about calling out and getting people in trouble. It's about calling out like, hey, you shouldn't say that. That's wrong, right? So I just think that sharing your story, and I'll share this with you. I had some middle school boys last year really using the N-word, and they're using it in a way that's to them, it's like almost like camaraderie. I brought them in and I shared with them my experience, the one that you're talking about when I was with my daughter and we were doing the NAACP membership drive and someone called me the N-word. I shared with them my experience. Some of them were appalled. Some of them laughed, and they laughed because it was uncomfortable, because I was sharing something with them that was very vulnerable and very hard for me. But it was important for me to share with them so that they could understand. Here's the other thing. Kids are so far removed from the meaning behind that word, they don't really understand the consequences. So that's just another reason for sharing our story, bringing people in to maybe share their stories, whether that's through PD or our own personal stories. Sometimes it's good to come like somebody on the outside, share some of their history with kids so that they can realize it. But I think it had an impact on them. And I got to tell you, it doesn't matter how young they are, because I had that conversation with 5th graders and 3rd graders when that word came up on a school bus or on the playground, or they heard it. It was important. You know what? My 5th graders, I shared the story with them because somebody had used that word, not really understanding the impact of that word. I got a bunch of beautiful handwritten cards for them the next day. They were so angry that anybody would say such a thing to Mrs. Osterhoudt, because they knew I loved them. We love our students. They're our kids. And they could see that I was hurt. And I think the first time I shared the story, I probably was a little teary-eyed and I had to leave the classroom before I wanted to leave the classroom. So they saw that I was upset. Yeah. And that vulnerability was important, and it was hard for me, but I knew I had to share that with them. And it was actually still pretty fresh. So it was really hard for me to share it.
Boy, am I thinking about states around the union right now who have decided that they're going to erase history. And I mean, your story is such an important one as a reminder of why it's so important to know our history so that we don't continue to make the same mistakes. And so for a child who's so removed potentially from hate speech, from why that word is so destructive and how it was used to dehumanize humans, and not knowing, and then maybe never knowing because we've decided in some states that we're just not going to include it in our curriculum because, you know, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, it's awful, because it's not like, I mean, if you're familiar with human rights, we know that this type of behavior is on the rise. We know that we're seeing it in school. So we have to address it. We have to talk about it. And here's the thing. Kids don't know what they don't know. So if they're doing something that's wrong, and I'm going to tell you something, it's also not right to really accost them and make them feel bad and make them feel awful for saying what they say, because they may not know. Or, Peter, they may grow up in households where it's okay.
Right. So
the only way to get across to them is by sharing personal experiences and why this might make somebody feel bad, because they can relate to that, but they can't relate to getting in trouble and us yelling at them.
I had an assistant superintendent who used to always say to me, remember, we're an institution of learning. So let's help children learn.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I'm going to use that.
Isn't that great?
I'm going to use that.
I loved it. Jen Ruckstedt, she was fantastic. And it was such a good reminder, because sometimes my impulse was, all right, that's it. That's kids.
It's because we're only human. We get upset. We get disappointed. We have to remember they're children, and we don't know what schema they bring to the picture.
Exactly.
We don't
it's such a good
know.
reminder. The things that children hear outside of school absolutely are how they've been socialized, and the 5 years before they even got to us. So they have been, steeped in potentially this cultural field of their homes that is one of hate and ignorance, and we're trying to catch up.
I got to tell you something. My first year as a middle school teacher, I had a new student come from another district. It was early in the fall, and after class, she came up to me and she said, "My mom warned me that if I came to Oneonta," it was Oneonta City School District, I was a middle school teacher there. "My mom told me that I'd see more Black people and it would be weird." And she said to me, she goes, "You're not weird, Mrs. O. I love you, Mrs. O. You're so much fun." And I thought, I don't know what she heard in her household, but she hadn't seen people of color like she saw in Oneonta. And Oneonta is not terribly, it's more diverse than where I am right now, but it's, compared to some other places in the state, it's, it is a college town, so that brings a level of diversity because of that. But I remember her, like, she was worried. She was worried about seeing Black people. And then through my class, she got to know me and she felt comfortable. And I thought, so when you talk about the 5 years or before they get to us, what they're exposed to, they could be exposed to nobody who looks different than them.
How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
I think an imperfect leader is an authentic leader, and an imperfect leader is okay being vulnerable. And I'm a proud imperfect leader because nobody's perfect, right? People are often surprised when I admit my mistakes or I apologize for something. I'm hoping that gives me a level of credibility and trust. My job is hard, so I have to make decisions that people don't always understand and don't always like. Being an imperfect leader, allowing myself to make mistakes, I need to reflect on them and then grow from them. That's why I love this job. I love the challenges and the difficulties of it. I'm not gonna lie, I was looking for a new job last week. I was so frustrated. A really good leader is always learning and understands that they are always learning and there's always more to learn.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And our guest today is Superintendent Michelle Osterhoudt. Michelle, this is the part of the program where we ask a leader to deconstruct a decision that they made and then we discuss it. So, what happened?
Oh, I can't believe I'm going to say this out loud. I'm going to say it out loud. I haven't talked about this out loud. So here we go, Peter. You're the first. Lucky you. My first year, well into 3/4 of my first year, we embarked on strategic planning, Blueprint for Excellence. And it's a wonderful strategic plan. I stand behind it. My board stands behind it. I had a really difficult time getting teacher buy-in. In fact, when we had our first strategic planning session, there were community members, there was the Board of Education, there was our leadership team, and I think there was one teacher. So, and then some other staff, support staff members. And I was really angry that teachers didn't show up. And the mistake that I made was the lack of engaging them leading up to that strategic planning session. So I was jazzed about it. I put out emails, I put out thought exchanges. I think I needed to be, I know I needed to be more immersed in speaking with individuals and speaking with them as a group and bringing them on board that way, as opposed to, we're having this meeting, come to this meeting. And I'm pretty sure I know what happened was it was an after hours meeting. People are like, we're not getting paid for this meeting. We're not going to go to this meeting. And I was angry because I thought professionally, they should want to come anyway to be a part of our new vision, our new strategic plan. But what I didn't realize, or maybe I realized and I didn't think that it was important, this was my big mistake, was that they had already done some work on a strategic plan. And I was a new leader coming in, right? And trying to implement this new strategic plan. And my thought was, well, I'm doing this the right way. I'm inviting all the stakeholders. I want them to be engaged. But what they saw was me throwing out the hard work that some of them had already done.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
And I have a lot of opinions about how their old strategic plan came into play. And I was being really selfish in that I wanted this wonderful thing for our district. My school board was 100% on board. My admin team was on board. They were excited about the energy that I brought. And the teachers were just like, we already did this work. And so in hindsight, I might have slowed down. In hindsight, I might have engaged them in small groups and individually before I said, let's come together and do this thing. And so I learned that as much as I was passionate about it, I needed to really plant the seeds well in advance of what happened. So we have a new strategic plan. We're slowly getting people to see the value of it, but I really learned, it humbled me. It humbled me because I came into this job really feeling like I knew everything, and not everything, but like I knew.
But you were ready. Yeah.
I was ready. And I knew that this was what was right for the district. But by doing so, unintentionally, I really sort of dismissed the work that had already been done.
Thank you so much for sharing the story with us. And the reason why I say that is not just because we're the first, but because so many people listen to this program with an interest in how they can do the job better. And so many who are entering the superintendency will be in a very similar situation where they are hired by a board as they have cast a vision for what they think the board is interested in, but more importantly, their values, and they see that it aligns and they want to do good work. They then engage in some conversations around what needs to be done, and then they begin this really important work with their board around the strategic planning and setting not just the vision, but actual actionable steps to move forward. And sometimes we fail to get a beat on the system, having conversations with our teachers unions, and other parts to know what work has gone on before we even got there, right? We're in this sort of, I'm equally guilty of, I get there and I'm like, aren't you so happy I have arrived? Let me tell you our 8 goals, as opposed to really, and part of that is synthesizing what I've read about the district and saying, oh, well, this makes sense. This will be one of their goals. This makes sense. This will be one of their goals. And failing to remember that what systems thinkers do is they engage and understand all the different systems that are at play within and between their district. So not just those who are in the system, but even your community members who probably have given some time and effort to think about where they want the schools to go as well. Oh my. So, all right. So typically I ask, what got overlooked? It sounds like what got overlooked was the taking that step back of what work has been done to this point.
Yeah. I invited them to the table and I was so hurt. I would be honest with you, I was hurt that people didn't come to the table. And I thought, but I invited you. And they were probably thinking, but we already did this.
Yeah.
And why are you overlooking what we've already done?
Yeah.
And I was just like, I can't believe nobody's showing up. So it was miscommunication, right? You could chalk it up to some miscommunication. I felt so supported by the board, and the board and I have such similar visions. They will tell me all the time, we didn't know what our vision was until you came along. And that pat on the back made me feel really good. But I think it gave me the feeling that I had more liberty to do what I wanted to do than I actually had. I really needed to pull in more folks.
Well, then that let me ask you this question. So what did you learn about relationships?
That's the thing that I would say is the most important thing to me as a person, whether it's in leadership, whether it's in the work that I do outside of work, with family, with friends, that's the most important thing to me. So what I learned about relationships is, number one, they take time. And for a leader in a district that has had a lot of turnover with leaders, which mine has, you have to earn trust. So you're not going to have a relationship with people if you haven't earned their trust yet. I probably took some steps back how I did the process. In my mind, I was inviting people to the table and they didn't come. And so then I was kind of like, well, you didn't come. You could have been involved, but you didn't come. But I really needed to sort of massage them to coming, to build the trust and the relationship with them first, even stronger. And I had thought I had done that, but clearly I hadn't done it enough.
Yeah, it's like that the piece of giving honor to the work that they've done. I'm curious though, were there major differences between the work that they had done and the work that was now being proposed?
Not really. And I will tell you, the board had said the district was on part of a state improvement plan. So there was a strategic plan that was an academic strategic plan that aligned with the state improvement plan. So when we got off the state improvement plan, I saw that as the perfect opportunity to embark on a district-wide strategic plan. So the state improvement plan was a lot of stakeholders and a lot of teachers, but it was different than an actual strategic plan for the entire district, one that the board got behind and everybody got behind. So where I failed was educating people about that, because they really thought that what they had done before was a district-wide strategic plan.
Being able to stand up with your community and say, what we've been doing to this point has been about compliance. And what we want to be doing is around, I don't even know the term, I'd say vision is we want children, right? We want to be able to invite children in other districts to come here to take chemistry. We want to give opportunities for kids to go take physics in other classes. We want to provide an RNA program or a program at the local hospital. That's vision. And that's a step away from compliance. And maybe that was a piece that maybe got overlooked.
And that would have been an opportunity for me to teach them and for us to learn together what the process of creating a district-wide blueprint for excellence, which is what our strategic plan is called, So it was a missed opportunity on my part.
So sometimes we say what got overlooked, and that was the teachers needed to be involved, or at least their work honored, and at least demonstrating value there. Sometimes I ask, so what could you have done differently? Do you see a difference in that question? Was there something that you could have done differently that was different from what got overlooked?
I really just some education and some engagement with teachers, really me being more engaged. And I like to think of myself as door's not open right now. It's been a really rough year. Let me just tell you right now. And I know that, no, it's okay. It's part of the work, right? But what I would have done differently is I felt like I was really getting to connect with people, but just bringing them in. Like, I think that here's what I needed to do. I have to be able to control what I can control. So I know that a lot of teachers didn't show up for those meetings because they were outside of the school day. So what I would do differently is make the time within the school day. If that meant hiring substitutes or hiring people and engaging stakeholders that way in small groups, I would have done that. So, and a mentor told me that. Control what you can control, Michelle. Are there times during the day that you can engage them? Whether we do have some time built in our schedule where there's administratively directed planning time. I could have used it. So I learned that use what I have available to me.
That's
instead of saying, well, it's a really good place, right? Well, they were invited, they didn't come. Well, they were invited outside of the confines of the school day. And you know what? At first that bothered me because I thought, well, if you really want to be involved, if you really care about your school, that was the wrong take for me to take.
Right.
Because isn't their time valuable? Isn't their time outside of school valuable?
Right.
I will tell you mine is.
Right.
I shouldn't.
What a wise reflection. Yeah, that's really wise.
Yeah.
In the end, though, what was something that was good that came out of the situation?
Me honestly, so it was a learning experience for me. So now I know moving forward, as we embark on really bringing people on board with that strategic planning work, there'll be a couple of things. I'll use the time that I have, right? If it's important, then we'll take the time to do it, even if that means taking some time during the school day and hiring subs. That's number one. Number two, and I've already started to do this, is things that align with our mission and vision and our strategic plan. PD, that's really powerful. Last summer, I took a good number. I want to say there were 7 or 8 of us, and admin and teachers and a board member who went to a diversity symposium in Ithaca, New York. And it was so powerful for those.
Was Lavelle there?
Lavelle was there. My man Lavelle was there. One of my mentors. He did 2 keynotes for me as an NAACP.
Culture of love.
Culture of love, baby. And it was eye-opening. So we're going to go every year. I'm going to bring new teachers every year to that symposium because it opened their eyes and they appreciated, I believe they appreciated being valued and that, you know what, we want you to come. We're going to pay for you to go to this conference. It's important work that will help us do our work.
And you cannot discount the time away from your district and the time just to be together as people. And you really get another deeper level of understanding.
I think they saw me in a different light.
Yep.
I know they saw me in a different light. They saw my admin team in a different light. They were able to spend time, even with the board president. It was a really rich experience.
Oh, I love that you brought your board too. That's so important. Good for you.
Yeah, it was great. And so I know that I need to do more. They need more of that. I know they appreciated it. They felt like professionals. They need more of that. So that was really a big deal.
Our guest today was Michelle Osterhoudt, the superintendent of Margaretville Central Schools in Margaretville, New York. And I first of all, I want to thank you so much for how genuine you are. I really appreciate it. You are such an inspiration. As I was listening to the conversation, I was trying to think of what is a word that really comes to mind. And really it's about connection and connecting. Every bit of our conversation today was about connecting kids to meaningful education, not just a traditional model. I have memories of growing up on Long Island and taking the Regents exam in a big auditorium in Southside High School. So I was like, Regents exam. But I learned so much from you about connecting and then meaningful connection. So it's not one to just say that you are an ally. It's one to say, I'm going to be a disruptor. And that is building meaningful connections between and among systems so that we can do great work for our communities, more importantly, our kids, because that leads to better work for our community. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So we're back from the conversation with Michelle. And what I want to do is I was listening to Julia Louis-Dreyfus, her podcast, and at the end of her podcast, I didn't know this, but she talks to her mother, and she says, Mom, what did you think of the conversation? Very much like what we do. And so what I like about that is that it isn't this abrupt move to the conversation. She's very deliberate. So we're going to start doing that. What a great conversation with Michelle. And now it's time to bring back Jamie Almanzan. Jamie, what were some of your thoughts?
I have a couple of questions that came up at the end, after listening to Michelle, that I'm interested in talking about. She talked about being a middle school teacher, her first job as a middle school teacher. I will talk about what really was my second job as a teacher, but a middle school teacher as well. One of the only Latino teachers on campus. I start an after-school club for Latino students on campus, which is a small population of Latino students, mostly for, I don't really know, probably just identity connection, camaraderie, and honestly, homework support was the intent. And no kids showed. No one came. And I got angry at the students. I went after the Latino students and I was pissed. And I'm like, I am the only teacher here. I translate IEP meetings. If you don't come to the one place that is trying to overtly advocate for you academically, it only reinforces the stereotype that exists about Latino students here at the school, that we don't care about school. And there was one student, most kids ignored me, one student who said, Mr. Almanzan, if you don't know why we're not at your club, then we're really lost. And I was like, what do you mean? I just love it because I was so dumb. He said, we take a bus. Anything that runs after school, no one can attend. If you don't get on the bus at 2, you're walking home. The walk's about an hour and a half. There's no way that anybody will ever do anything after school. And I knew they took a bus. I just didn't know they took a bus. It wasn't, and do you want to know why? I never took a bus growing up. I did for going to the mall or whatever, but to go to school, no, I lived close enough to most of my schools. So it wasn't a part of my experience. And as a result, I didn't listen to them. I didn't take their experience into account. I created a support system that will never work, ever. And when it didn't work, I blamed them. Then once that aha happened, the first move was I became the telling every teacher that they take a bus person. So when people would complain, Latino students don't really join after school sports. And I'm like, they take a bus. I'm yelling like Paul Revere through the hallways because I thought it was such new information. It was new information to me, must be new information to everybody else. And then eventually you start to realize, it's not about them knowing. Nobody is changing anything because they take a bus. What needs to happen is we need to change how sports and clubs and support are being offered because they take a bus.
I hear your story and it makes me think of Michelle's reflection of, at first I was upset. Yeah. And then I realized I didn't really include them as much as I had thought I was including them because, First of all, they had already been a part of a previous iteration of this plan. And more importantly, I was asking them to come after school, and their bus was their lives outside of school. So, for you at your school saying, hey, they got to take a bus. There ought to be someone also doing the same thing. Hey, they have a life outside of the school. They ought to have a life and families. And she said that. She said, oh my God, they have families and they have. So I need to build this into the day, just like any other profession. All right, listen, I want to shift gears. When you're working with the school district, are you contacted by the school district or the schools to work with them in response to an event? Or are they seeing patterns of behavior and underperformance, and over time, these are things that they want to address? I'm curious, how often do you get called in to put out the fire, essentially?
I don't have data on that to be able to answer your question clearly. Okay. I can take a guess, and I will say.
Would you say yes, more often than not, our clients are mostly those who are thinking long term about what they want, the kind of changes that they're hoping to see in their communities, as opposed to we've had swastikas written on the walls. Come talk about anti-Semitism.
The presentation to the entire staff because there was an event at the football game is rarely if ever. It won't. Nothing will change. That's not
Right.
what would change.
Right.
That's usually because you have a legal mandate that requires that you do something.
Right. Right. Right.
And so to do that, they just put everybody in the same room and they run a 2-hour keynote training. And you know how those goes. Everybody knows how those goes.
Makes me I always compare it to the Matrix. It's like, I know Kung Fu, because I've been plugged in.
I don't think it's as good. I don't think it's anywhere near as good.
No,
at least in the Matrix,
at least he knows
Kung Fu.
That's true.
Exactly.
It's true. It's
I
like,
compare this to the
unmatrix. Like, I know Kung Fu. You do? No.
Yeah. Well, they said they were going to download it, but it didn't work. I still don't know Kung Fu. I don't want to.
Faulty connection.
Yeah. It makes me think. I always compare it to the bloodborne pathogen video that you have to watch as an educator. Here's this 20-minute video on bloodborne pathogens, and
I'm going to tell you about student voice because this is something that you so value. We had students at one of our high schools work with the nurse, and they created a better movie as if it were a zombie apocalypse. And then they taught the bloodborne pathogen, the whole thing. And, and all of a sudden in Missouri and different teachers, because they hadn't worn the mask or they hadn't worn the gloves, they became infected and it took over the school. And the principal is locked in her room and is going through all the steps that she needs to take to make sure that she's ready to deal with the bloodborne pathogen. It was so good.
That's so great. That's so great.
Good.
I love that. That's a great story.
It's so funny.
Also fun.
Yeah.
That was my. Usually, though, I could have to go back to the helping us system with the N-word. We usually start with the frame of understanding, like asking them, what do they do when they see a physical fight? And when they see a physical fight, they intervene. They stop the actual physical harm that could happen as a result of that fight. Because for a number of reasons, care for kids being number one. But number two, there are legal reasons for intervening on the fight. All right. So any racial slur, any slur, identity-based slur, is an emotional fight, and it has a potential to be an emotional fight. So, step one, intervene. You intervene because you don't want someone to get hurt, and there are legal repercussions if people get hurt. So what that does is it basically says stop. What it doesn't do, the recovery phase is not there. What I've given you is a tool for intervention. I haven't given you a tool for recovery. And recovery is all the restoration that has to go with being a part of that.
That is such a profound example. And I really appreciate you distinguishing intervening, which is something you could possibly do as a one-time event with a team. And the other piece of recovery is the long-term prospect. We only have about a minute left or so. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we say goodbye?
She opens with, by nature, I'm a teacher. And I wondered, are you a teacher by nature?
Yes. In fact, that was one of the best compliments I got from my union president, actually, was that she says, you really miss being a teacher. You think of yourself as a teacher first. I was like, yes. I don't want to talk about bonds. I don't want to talk about levies.
She's so clearly a teacher. I loved that about her. It obviously personally resonated with me, and she talks like a teacher.
Yes. And this is what I will tell you about being a superintendent. To some extent, you have to park your identity as a teacher. I know you're going to say no. It doesn't mean that you don't lead as a teacher. However, there are so many other pieces coming at you that teachers don't deal with. That's not their role, and nor should it be. And so to some extent, you have to become business-minded, a lawyer, all these other pieces that you ought to do your very best to keep out of the classroom. Because you don't want
Well, I finished the thought.
Like, you don't want teachers thinking about that. You want them thinking about teaching and learning and the development of children to become great.
How often did your job as superintendent get in the way of supporting teachers?
Oh, I would say never, because I don't think you're asking the question that you intend to ask, because I would say that everything I was doing was to be supportive of teachers.
And what's the question I'm intending to ask? I'm maybe not asking it right.
What if your job allowed you to be a teacher? And I would say probably 40%, because I saw myself as the community's teacher. So I taught the community about what was important for the children in our community. And I will then go back to Michelle, where she says we have to create diverse learning pathways. When she talked about her child, I saw that as my role of teaching the community. Hey, I know we're in a community with 3 colleges, the flagship university in the state, 2 smaller colleges, and then other colleges just outside of our community. So we're a community of higher learning. I got it. Here's the thing. I don't think that every kid needs to go to a 4-year school. They need to have a plan is what they need. So it could be a 2-year, it could be a 4-year, it could be an internship, it could be the military, it could go right into the job force. So, and that was a shift in the way that people talked. So I saw myself as the teacher teaching the community that was important.
All of those other things that don't make you be that where you're not a teacher. Is there ever a time where they can be in conflict with what would be supportive or what teachers are even asking for help?
Yes. So I'll do facilities. We would build schools where we would centrally make decisions about the temperature in that building. And teachers would say, I just want to open my window. And we built schools that the windows didn't open because windows were often left open, and then that would throw off the entire system, and then you're running your heating
and massive.
Right. And yet I wanted to give them opportunities to be able to open up their windows.
For every after-action review seems to be about something that happened unintentionally. Has there ever been one that's about intentional harm? Like, I knew that was going to hurt. I knew that was going to be bad, but I had to do it. And then they said, shit.
That's interesting. I'll have to think about that one. I mean, there's some where it's like, I knew I had to fire this teacher and I knew it was going to go bad. And I knew that the community was going to come after me because this person was so loved. And I knew that I was in a position where I can't tell you the reason. And so everybody writes their own story and narrative around what happened. And
humility is easier when it's unintentional. It's easier to get there than it is when it's intentional, when you're intentionally doing something, when your behavior is intentionally bad.
So
it was great.
See you next week.
See you next week, Peter. I look forward to it.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print-inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast.